For those of you who've done some reading of the ACE research, you know that it's compelling. And the implications for pediatricians and for mental health providers is really pretty significant. And my hope is that today you'll leave with a greater understanding of trauma and its long-term effects on kids as they grow up, and might even see interventions in high-risk families in a new light. You and I are all in the trenches, aren't we? We work with kids and families that really have unthinkable things happening to them. One of the things my residents and I frequently say, almost on a daily basis, is you couldn't write this. And you probably know what I'm talking about with that. Sometimes we feel like we're putting the toothpaste back in the tube, and it's pretty difficult sometimes. But we all keep trying, don't we? I think you do, I do, Michael does. One patient and one client and one family at a time. And it kind of is like the story of the starfish on the beach. Man was walking thousands of starfish along the beach in the morning, and he was throwing each one back one by one. And a person comes along and says, "What are you doing? There's 1,000 starfish here. This isn't going to make a difference." And he goes, "It made a difference to that starfish." So I think all of you are in that setting as well. Some ask me how I got interested in behavioral pediatrics and child trauma research. On the outside, I might appear kind of untraumatized, old white guy with a dad bod, probably didn't go through a lot of childhood adversity, but not all that appears on the outside is the whole story, as you know. We really don't know each other's stories. That's something that always just boggles me. We walk by people all the time at the grocery store or in church or downtown or at work, and we see them, but we really don't know them. We really don't know them and what they have experienced or who they are. And I was stressed to my pediatric residents and medical students about resisting being judgmental, because we see a lot of families coming out of poverty, refugee camps, and things are pretty messed up. I tell my residents, when you see a new patient, ask what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. And I think that lens through which we treat people is probably much more positive. Trauma research has confirmed for years now what everybody's known, that life can be hard. We talked about that last hour. In fact, life can be downright unfair, mean, and miserable for some people. My upbringing was difficult. Both my parents were alcoholics. My mom had severe depression and was diagnosed with bipolar. I witnessed domestic violence, both emotional and physical, between my parents. My mom committed suicide. All three of us kids were emotionally abused, especially during drinking cycles. And we lived under this umbrella of the family secret. My ACE score was 5. And I can honestly tell you that I'm very thankful to my family, because it was eventually used to shape who I am today and what I'm doing. Now, don't misunderstand me. I deeply loved my parents, and they did a lot right. They did. In fact, I couldn't blame them, because their upbringings were much more traumatic than mine. But with the help and influence of 3 men in my life growing up, my high school choir director and my best friend's dad and my family doctor, I wouldn't be standing here today. Yes, an adversity-filled childhood can have lifelong consequences for the child who experienced it firsthand. And as with my story, there are consequences for those who happen to be their children. Most of our life work deals with problems that started a long time ago, maybe generations ago. And now we try to pick up the pieces and put people back together. And as you know, it's an uphill battle. As Frederick Douglass so aptly put it, it's easier to build strong children than to fix broken men. And that's where I think our focus needs to change as mental health providers and pediatricians who take care of kids and families. And every attempt should be made to go upstream with these families, to the headwaters, and give our kids that we take care of and our families a paddle to paddle with. Tommy was 13 when I first met him, and he was referred for aggressive behaviors, fighting, pulling a knife on a person, getting kicked out of school, and spending time in juvenile detention. He was brand new to my clinic and came with his list of things. And he had moved to our area about 6 months before from out of state. I'm always curious to read the list of reasons a kid is referred to my behavior clinic. Most of the time, it doesn't really reflect the reality of the kid or the family. And upon entering the exam room, Tommy was neatly dressed in well-combed hair and stood up, introduced himself, shook my hand. My first thought was, this kid doesn't look or act like a troublemaker. What's the deal? And by the history, he had been seen multiple times by several different child psychiatrists before he moved to the area and had been tried on a variety of ADD medications, depression medications, and aggression medications. None of those helped, and he just had side effects. So my feeling was it's time to start unpacking some history here and really find out what's going on. It's really interesting. Tommy had never met his biological dad. In fact, his mom told me that she wasn't sure who his dad was. She had had so many relationships. Tommy was her first child, and her next relationship was with a man who fathered her next two children, Tommy's two little stepsisters who were 4 and 6 years younger than him. His stepfather was an alcoholic and abused Tommy's mom on a daily basis, and Tommy witnessed all of it. He also physically and emotionally abused Tommy, slapping him around and yelling at him, especially when he was trying to help his mom. Tommy's stepdad took his two younger stepsisters away and moved out of state. And in the 4 years since that had happened, Tommy was never given the opportunity to speak to his little sisters. With time, his mom started her own journey with alcoholism and started taking opiates that she got for chronic pain, and unfortunately, her chemical dependency became so significant it destroyed any semblance of responsibility for her child, Tommy. So DCS got involved and custody was transferred to the maternal grandmother. And the two stepsisters remained with their father, whereabouts unknown. In the previous 4 years before I met Tommy, his mom had been in 25 treatment programs. When she was sober and clean, Tommy would move in with her, and things seemed like maybe, just maybe, and those of you who grew up in alcoholic families, maybe something would be different. But many times over, his mom relapsed, and Tommy would again experience the disappointment and loss he had grown all too accustomed to. And he'd go back to his grandmother's, which was actually a place he preferred. Fortunately, she was solid. She became his parent figure and his only stable influence in his life. She stressed the importance of hard work and overcoming hardship and had expectations and goals for him, including doing really well in school. And Tommy was a bright kid. At one time, the mom told me that she had told her that she had made so many mistakes with her own kids that this was her chance to do it different with her grandson. I asked Tommy why he'd been kicked out of school, and he replied that he felt compelled to beat up any bully in his school. And he did. He got in a lot of fights. I asked Tommy about the knife incident, and he replied that one of his mom's boyfriends was beating her up one night, so he called the police and then held the man at knife point until they arrived, and he was 12. And out of fear of retribution, his mom refused to back up Tommy's story, refused to push or make charges, and Tommy went to juvenile detention. The boyfriend got off, and mom relapsed again. About 2 years before I met Tommy, his grandmother was diagnosed with cancer. And after 18 months of battling that, she died. And Tommy saw that whole progressive deterioration. And so she died about the same time that they moved to the area. So Tommy was now living again with his mom, just 4 months into sobriety after her most recent treatment program. They were in a new city. Tommy was in a new school, and the most important and positive person in his life had died. Tommy's ACE score was 7, and he was only 13 when I met him. His mother's ACE score was 7. Let's talk a little bit about chronic toxic stress, because that's what this is about. We were entertaining some friends from Minneapolis last month in Arizona, and Kent, who is the husband in the couple, and I were finishing our last hole of golf on a round of golf, and we were going to meet my wife, Susan, and his wife, Becky, for dinner at one of our favorite places. And then on the 18th hole, I was setting up for a 160-yard 8-iron, and no, anybody play golf? No, okay, all right. Wrong crowd for golf jokes? Sorry. But we were just finishing our round, and I got this text. What do I do? This beautiful 4-foot diamondback rattlesnake decided to explore a garage as my wife and Becky were pulling out. And my wife was so funny, she actually looked at the snake, which was in the parking spot that I normally take. And you know what she said to Becky? "Is that a rubber snake?" Truth. I mean, where would a rubber snake come from? So anyways, I said, I don't know what to do. And I thought to myself, this is an example of mild stress, mainly because I wasn't there. But Susan, the snake slayer, got a Costco portable table and a concrete squeegee and battled this thing out of the garage before the firemen came and disposed of it. So stress comes in various forms, including rattlesnakes. As you know, there's mild stress. This is kind of the typical once-in-a-while kinds of stress that all of us experience from day to day. Examples for a child might include getting a failing grade on a math test, or breaking your wrist, or not making the varsity soccer team, or having a sleepover canceled. We'll never forget, I drove home one night. Our oldest daughter was 13. It was Friday afternoon, and she had a sleepover with 2 of her best friends. And I drive up into our driveway, and she's on the front stoop weeping. And she dramatically runs, remember she's a theater art major. She dramatically ran out to the car as I'm pulling up the driveway. And I roll the window down, push the button. And she goes, "Mom canceled my sleepover." And I looked at her and I said, "You must have really pissed off your mother." And up the window went, and I drove in. So, I think some things are kind of mild stress. Sometimes kids overreact to those things. But they can be overcome with an appropriate amount of social emotional buffering. And we're really going to talk about the importance of social emotional buffering, because it's critical. Having such a resource contributes to less adverse impact from negative life events. So parents, typically we think of as being social emotional buffers. You probably work with kids whose parents may not be the best social emotional buffers for their child. And you might actually take on that role, or a friend's parent, or a teacher, or a youth pastor. All of those adults can be in that role. And when a kid knows that there's a person or people behind him supporting him, he's motivated to move through and past a trauma. He's helped to understand the context of the event, the bigger picture of his life, and the buffering person will, in essence, teach him resilience and self-regulation so that the next time something happens, it will be measured for what it is and what it isn't. And so this new life skill for kids of putting events into context is an important part of moving through and maturing through life. And with mild stress, the return to baseline is the rule. The second kind of stress is what we call tolerable stress. It's infrequent but involves change. Examples of tolerable stress might include move to a new town, loss of a beloved family pet or relative, being diagnosed with a chronic illness, like a kid who gets diagnosed with diabetes. And these events really require more social emotional buffering than mild trauma does, and typically with multiple caring adults. It's very important that in these circumstances, the chance to learn about perseverance and resilience is quite high, as long as the buffering is there. Usually these situations, the kid returns to baseline with adequate buffering. But the memories tend to be long-term, and we all can probably remember maybe a move in 5th grade or things like that were very traumatic to us. And hopefully we can draw on those things in future times in positive ways. Third type of stress, and mainly what we're thinking about today, is toxic chronic stress. This is frequent. It can be daily, extreme, and high intensity. This stress causes chaos inside a child and makes them maladaptive in the ways that they manage life. Examples of this might be growing up in a family with chemical dependency, different forms of neglect or abuse, divorce or separation from parents, especially contentious separation, domestic violence, incarceration of a close family member. And in many families, there's insufficient buffering from the parents because they're incapable or unable to supply it to their child. And without that, the child marinates in their high levels of stress hormones, sometimes for years, creating a dysregulation and imbalance in their body's ability to process stress. What we now know is that the child's brain and the structure, the biochemistry, all can be changed by chronic stress. And in the young child, neural development is actually influenced and interrupted. These disruptions can be mediated through epigenetic changes. Has anybody heard that term before? Great. Through epigenetic changes to the expression of their DNA, and a return to baseline usually doesn't happen. In essence, a child grows up in toxic chronic stress, lives with its physical and mental consequences for the rest of their life. The physiology of the stress response is very complicated and involves kind of a dance between two main systems, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the sympathetic adrenomedullary pathway. And these two systems create the stress hormones cortisol and noradrenaline or norepinephrine. And these are very important when we're being attacked by a vicious pit bull or dealing with the loss of a close relative. These things kick into gear. The problem occurs, of course, when the stress is constant and intense over long periods of time, and these stress hormones and neurotransmitters are excessive and uncontrolled, and actually get to a point of unable to be shut down and shut off. And this creates constant feelings of angst and urgency. The bottom line is the higher the intensity and the longer the intensity, irreversible changes will occur in the brains of kids which affect their health the rest of their life. So why don't our bodies turn this off when the stress takes a break? Well, we now know that there's several ways stress influences the brains of children. The first is epigenetics. This is a new and kind of developing science that's explaining at the molecular level what happens in toxic and chronic stress. Research has now shown that the ecology of the child, the environmental and emotional stresses a child experiences, cause change to a complex set of DNA switches, which affect the expression of different stress-related genes in the child. Essentially, the early experiences of the child, their ecology, becomes biologically embedded, and gene expression is influenced in ways that are detrimental. Eye-opening example of this process was published in Epigenetics in 2015. And this pushed the envelope back into looking at fetal sensitivity to maternal stress during pregnancy. And in pregnant women who were experiencing toxic stress, not only did they experience, but their developing babies experienced it as well. And that stress in the fetus caused epigenetic changes through a process we call methylation of the fetal glucocorticoid receptor gene. The results were newborns with hyperreactivity of their HPA axis and increased cortisol levels as well. And they presented as unstable in their physiology and in their emotional regulation as newborns. In essence, these babies exposed to toxic stress of their mothers during pregnancy were born with dysregulated stress hormones. And it was changed at a molecular level. Along this line, research is assessing other ways that chronic and toxic stress changes a child's brain. And from that, we're finding that the size and shape of the developing brain is changed. 2012, researchers at Boston Children's published studies showing chronically high levels of cortisol actually shrink a child's hippocampus. That's the area responsible for processing memory and emotions. In MRI studies from Harvard's biopsychiatry research program, the higher the ACE score, the smaller your prefrontal cortex, used for decision-making and self-regulation, and the smaller your amygdala, which is mission control for stress and fears. The University of Maryland studies have revealed that neural pruning is affected by chronic stress. And through microglia, which are non-neuronal brain cells that are responsible for pruning excess neurons and connections, they digest and cause inflammation in the brain. As they're turned on by chronic stress, this neuroinflammation makes it much more likely for a child to develop mood disorders and have poor executive functioning.